What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with yet another discography ranking for you guys. Now, I put up a poll shortly after I did the Testament discography ranking, even with Celtic Frost set in stone for the following ranking after Testament. I put up a poll for you guys to decide what band you want me to talk about next, and it was all death metal oriented, and with an overwhelming victory, you guys spoke up, and the band we're going to be talking about here is none other than Morbid Angel. So how I got into Morbid Angel, I've been saying it pretty much for the past several discography rankings. Around junior high, like tail end of junior high, heading into high school was when I was getting into thrash, and then eventually worked my way up to death metal around sophomore, junior year of high school. I listened to Death and Cannibal Corpse, and Morbid Angel came in around the same time for me, and I've been a fan of Morbid Angel ever since. I have a good chunk of their albums in the collection, pretty much the awesome stuff, and we'll talk about those when we get to the ranking. But Morbid Angel, still a fan, and hopefully we'll get some new material before too long. But now let's get into the history of the band. Morbid Angel formed in 1984 out of Tampa, Florida, with their original lineup being Mike Browning on drums and vocals, Dallas Ward on bass, and Trey Azagtooth on guitar. This was the original lineup. Now, here and there during like the first year of the band, they would have other vocalists come in to kind of handle some stuff that Mike wasn't able to do at the time. But then in 1985, Dallas Ward had to leave the band due to being sent to jail for drug-related charges. So in steps in to take over on bass John Ortega, and they would also add second guitarist Richard Burnell, so they would now become a four-piece. And this lineup would go on for about a year, year and a half, and then sometime in 1986, they were spotted playing a big show with a bunch of other Florida bands like Massacre and such, spotted at the show by none other than David Vincent, who at the time had his own independent record label called Goric Records, and signed Morbid Angel to Goric Records and got them in the recording studio up in North Carolina, where David Vincent's from, to record what was intended to be their debut album, Abominations of Desolation. Now, they had everything recorded, ready to go, ready to be released. However, something happened during those recording sessions, and well, actually after the recording, but in the mixing stage, David pretty much sent the rest of the band back home, but left Trey there to do the mixing. That would cause some tension within the band, and then after Trey returned home from the mixing process, tensions happened between Trey and Mike, to the point where one day Mike's coming from work on a lunch break to where he lived with his girlfriend, only to find out that Trey and Mike's girlfriend were having a fling. So basically, Mike's girlfriend cheated on him with Trey. Later on that night, Trey was pissed off and decided that he was not going to play with the rest of the guys but keep Morbid Angel and go up to North Carolina to be with David Vincent, leading to a big physical altercation resulting in Mike Browning beating the shit out of Trey. Then, not too long afterwards, Richard Burnell would end up leaving Mike and go with Trey to join up with David Vincent, and caused a lot of friction there. And in the result, Mike Browning would end up forming Nocturnus a couple of years afterwards, who are a big staple in death metal, or were a big staple in death metal. Well, technically, because in Nocturnus AD. So, Trey and Richard moved up to North Carolina for a bit to form up with David Vincent, and would actually be trying to search around for different drummers until around 1988, where they would pick up Terrorizer drummer Pete the Feet Sandoval. And this was kind of a tumultuous, well, not really tumultuous, but kind of a weird time for Pete, because he had joined Morbid Angel, but it was also getting ready to record the Terrorizer album World Downfall. But right after they got Pete, so we get the core lineup of David Vincent on bass and vocals, Trey and Richard on guitars, and Pete on drums. And they would get picked up by Earache Records, and they were actually the first American band that Earache signed at the time, and would go to the studio to record their actual debut album in late 1988 and released in 1989, we get Altars of Madness. This is my #1 album. Holy shit, is this album a stone cold classic. Not just in death metal, but in metal as a whole. One of the best debuts for any metal band, period. Starting things off with the backwards introduction to Immortal Rights, and then that song just comes in, punches you right in the face. Top to bottom, it is cut after classic after classic, like Immortal Rights, Suffocation, Chapel of Ghouls, Visions from the Dark Side, Blasphemy, Evil Spells, like top to bottom. Not a wasted moment. All the vocals hit. And David Vincent's vocals were more of a thrash bark at this point, and this is really the only time you really get that like thrash metal side of Morbid Angel, but this is still full-on death metal, but with a lot of thrash on top of it. Like a lot of influence from Death and Possessed at this point, and decide, you know what? Let's just go as evil as we want. Like, almost like this is what would happen if Slayer was on cocaine. Because there is a lot of Slayer on this album as well, especially in some of the leads where Trey is just going absolutely wild with the whammy bar just to add to the chaos. And the production done by Dig and Tom Morris was fucking incredible for 1989 standards. Like, everything's audible, it's brilliantly mixed, and what more can I say? It's a stone cold classic album. Nothing more, nothing less to be said, other than the fact I don't think the band ever has topped this album, at least in my opinion, but they've written some incredible albums. And we're going to get on to some of those next. So this album became legendary pretty damn fast, and as a result of the success of this album, they ended up doing a pretty big tour over in England, the first Grind Crusher tour, playing with Bolt Thrower, Carcass, and Napalm Death, basically the 4 big bands on Earache Records at the time, so it was a pretty big deal for them to do this tour with 3 other legendary bands within extreme music. Now, after the momentum carried over from that tour, the band would go back to the studio in 1990, and released in 1991, we get their second album, Blessed Are the Sick. Blessed Are the Sick is my #4 album. Originally, I had this a lot higher. I actually had at #2 at one point, but going back through most of these albums, it fell a couple spots, but this is still another fantastic album. I thought it was a great follow-up to Altars of Madness. Granted, the biggest issue I think myself and a lot of other people have with this album is the production. Like, the guitars were not as crunchy as it was on Altars of Madness, and the drums were a little bit loud, and even David's vocals were way too loud in the mix. But you still have some incredible songs like Fall from Grace, the title track, Unholy Blasphemies, Day of Suffering. But this, you also heard a bit the beginnings of another trope that would start with Morbid Angel, especially later on in their career, where you get some like ambient songs kind of acting as transitions from one song to another, like Doomsday Celebration, where it's mostly like classical that led into Day of Suffering. Now, some people may not like those ambient transitional tracks. I liked them, but primarily on this album because they were all well done in their own way, like Doomsday Celebration being this classical, like sinister classical piece, and then like, why do I forget the song off the top of my head, but it was like an all acoustic track leading into, I believe it was Ancient Ones, towards the end of the album. So these ambient tracks I really liked on this album. Granted, the other ambient tracks you would get on later albums weren't as good and were kind of pointless, and we'll get to some of those later on. But Blessed Are the Sick, my #4. Now, they would go on a massive tour for this album, going to South America for the first time, and meeting up with some of their old friends like Sepultura and Sarcophago. Also getting to do another big European tour where, unfortunately, some near tragedy happened while they were on tour in '91 in Sweden. They were set to play Stockholm with Entombed and Unleashed opening up for them. where they had an accident with the trailer and their tour bus, and a lot of their equipment was broken, and then they went to Stockholm trying to get some equipment flown in from England, but some of the fans there actually tried to help them out and get them some equipment, but ultimately they didn't have playable equipment to play the show, so they ended up having to cancel, and leading to tensions between the management and the band and so on and so forth, but eventually it all worked out. Also, they would actually do a pretty big tour, Christmas festival tour in late 91 with Wolfsbane, Schmear's solo band at the time, Sepultura, Creator, and Motorhead, which was a pretty big deal for them as well, getting to play with some other legendary acts. However, not long after the tour for Blessed was over, Richard Brunel left the band due to creative differences, leaving us down to a three-piece with David, Trey, and Pete. And for this next album, and I keep forgetting to mention these early albums were recorded at the legendary Morrisound Studios. For this next album that they would begin recording in late 92 and early 93, they would pick up a legendary producer to come in, and that would be none other than Flemming Rasmussen, who most of you would know as the legendary producer for three of the best Metallica albums, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Injustice for All. He would come over to Florida to record and produce this next album, and also they would actually get a big major label deal with Giant Records. And they were the first extreme metal band to go to a major label, and instead of cashing in and making a polished, sellout, quote-unquote, album, they decided to create one of their most aggressive albums ever, and that would be 1993's Covenant. This is my number 2 album. Holy shit, this album's fucking fantastic. Starts right out of the gate with Rapture, and then just, again, top to bottom, just classic after classic. Tracks like Angel of Disease, which is one of my all-time favorite Morbid Angel songs, Sworn to the Black, World of Shit, The Promised Land, Lion's Den. Just absolutely incredible songwriting. And then, of course, the all-time classic, God of Emptiness, hell of a closer, creepy music video, and this was the second ever music video they did, and it was by far their best and scariest for sure. The hell, they got played on Headbangers Ball and on Beavis and Butthead during this time, which was fucking huge for the band. To me, this is the closest to Altars being overtaken is Covenant. Like, it's so close between the two, but Covenant lands at the number 2 spot only just because the drum production I felt could have been a little bit better, but it was still really cool to hear that interesting snare sound. I just prefer the drum production on Altars just a little bit more, at least as far as the snare goes. But yeah, Covenant, my number 2. So during the Covenant tour, they would pick up a new second guitarist, none other than Eric Rutan. And Eric Rutan, you want to talk about a badass guitar player? He had just gotten out of his old band Ripping Corpse after a bad departure with them, hopped on tour for the Covenant tour with Morbid Angel, and now Trey actually had somebody else who could play leads along with him, who could match the talent of Trey and Eric Rutan. And they went on a really big tour in 93 and 94, going throughout all over the world. Then in 1995, the band would return to the studio, and released in 1995, we get Domination. Still on Giant Records, however, Giant Records had them contracted up to 5 albums. This would end up being their last album on Giant Records. So I guess something happened and they wound up not on Giant anymore and would eventually go back to Earache Records altogether. Now, Domination is my number 6. Yeah, it's a little bit low, but it's still a great album. I think, apart from a couple of tracks, this album kicks ass. Songs like Dominate, Dawn of the Angry, and especially Where Does Slime Live, which is another staple of Morbid Angel. Now, the 2 tracks I feel this album causes the most division is Caesar's Palace and Hate Work. I personally love those songs because they're different for Morbid Angel. Like Caesar's Palace, you start off with this cool ambient intro, and then you get into like almost like a death doom or a groovy death song. and it kicked ass for me. And then Hate Work, with more of that, like, military marching style to it, kind of a precursor to what you would hear from bands like Nile, eventually. But yeah, it's only number 6 just because there were other albums that I liked more, but this is definitely the one Morbid Angel album in the entire catalog that's like you either love it or you hate it. Like, it's very divisive, but I think it's an awesome album. Like I said, it's only 6 just because I liked other ones more, but this album kicks some serious nuts. Now, a year later in 1996, after the Domination tour, David Vincent would leave the band, and eventually they would pick up Steve Tucker, fellow Ohioan, coming in on bass and vocals, and then Eric Rutan would actually end up leaving the band as well, leaving us back to being a 3-piece with Steve, Trey, and Pete, and back to Earache Records they go, and released in 1998, we would get Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. What a debut for Steve Tucker. He comes in full swinging, and this is my number 3 album. I would say in terms of what is the heaviest Morbid Angel album, this is the one, because holy shit, the guitars were so fucking heavy on here. And then, of course, the interesting difference between Steve Tucker and David Vincent, like, their growls are very similar, but here you also get some cool, like, layering with the vocals where you get the low growls of Steve, but you also get some high, almost black metal shrieks from Steve. So you get this cool layer effect between the two styles, similar to Deicide, but I'm going to say it. I think Steve Tucker's a better vocalist than Glenn Madden. Kill me if you want. But you have tracks on here like Heaving Earth, Hellspawn, The Rebirth, Covenant of Death, but especially the song that gets the most praise out of this album is Invocation of the Continual One, which is, I think, to this day, the longest Morbid Angel song ever. Almost 10 minutes of just insane musicality. Like, you get, like, some faster parts, you get some groove, and you get some doom in there, too. Like, this is maybe the doomiest song I think Morbid Angel has ever done, and it's primarily in the second half of the track where you get to hear some of their, like, Black Sabbath influence come through. And yeah, the production on here, it almost felt like a heavier version of Covenant a little bit in terms of the guitars, but the drums are kind of similar to the production on Covenant, which was really, really cool to hear. And this was a fucking big album in '98 for death metal during a time when death metal was seen as obscure at this point, which I still think is extremely hyperbolic. But I digress. Now, shortly after the Formula's Fatal to the Flesh tour, Eric Rutan would return to the band to play second guitar and would go back to the studio in late 1999 and early 2000, and released in 2000, we would get Gateways to Annihilation. This is my number 5 album. I think this was a great follow-up to Formula's Fatal to the Flesh. It's only lower than Formula's just because I feel like Formula's was just a little bit better in terms of the songwriting, but also the drum production, because the drum production on this album almost felt a little industrial-like, but then again, I give it a pass because this album came out during a very weird time for metal, because nu metal was pretty much holding sway, and industrial metal was kind of growing at this point because of bands like Static X getting big at this time. So, yeah, this album was released during a very weird time for metal, but the album itself kicks ass with tracks like Summoning Redemption, Ageless Still I Am, To the Victor the Spoils. Top to bottom, this is another brilliant offering from one of the legends of death metal as a whole. And of course, during this album cycle, they ended up being on a pretty big tour with Soulfly and Pantera, playing arenas. Like, I think this was the first instance of Morbid Angel, or really any death metal band, playing, like, big arenas for a tour. And it's funny, at least according to the guys over at Thralls of Metal, who actually saw this show, some of them saw this show in Toledo, and how Steve Tucker was on stage saying, you know, well, we're a little bit heavier, and I know why you all are here, and Pantera's great, and this has been a great tour, but we're what you call death metal. And even during this tour, Phil Anselmo would get up on stage to sing Day of Suffering with them, and did an excellent job. There's a clip of it somewhere out there on YouTube that you can check out. But yeah, Gateways to Annihilation, my number 5. Now, after Gateways to Annihilation, little bit of some strange stuff starts happening with Morbid Angel. Steve Tucker would leave for a little while, and in his place would be Jared Anderson from Hate Eternal coming in to play bass and do the vocals, at least through 2002. Then Steve Tucker would come back to the band. However, by this point, Eric Rutan had left the band once again. Steve Tucker came back, and then they would get back to the studio, and, well, this began what you could consider the dark ages of Morbid Angel, because released in 2003, and their final album on Earache Records, we would get Heretic. Now, the reason why this started the quote-unquote dark ages of Morbid Angel is because this was the first album to not be recorded at Morris Sound Studios. They actually went to Died of Worm Studios somewhere else in Florida with Juan Gonzalez doing the production, and boy did he screw the pooch on this album, because the mix is off, the drums sound strange, the guitar tone is thin and muddy. And for those reasons, that's why, well, and other reasons, this is my number 7 album. It's not quite near the bottom, or not quite at the bottom, but near the bottom. Also, some of the songs just felt uninspired. To me, there were 2 saving graces for me on this album. Those were the tracks Enshrined by Grace and God of Our Own Divinity. Enshrined by Grace was like the big single, and they got a music video for it. That's a great song. And then God of Our Own Divinity is a great song on this album that has Carl Sanders from Nile coming in to do some of the lead work on it. But aside from that, just not really much jumped out at me with this album. Of course, it all boiled down to the mix. Again, it's just poorly mixed. And it's funny that not long after the initial release, there was a special edition 2-disc version of this album where it's just a bunch of nothing. And honestly, the whole thing with this album, it's like after the track after God of Our Own Divinity, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now, but after that you just get like random as fuck silent tracks and instrumentals that just don't fit. This was a botched job, and yeah, not anywhere near my favorite at all. Number 7. And after the Heretic tour was over, Steve Tucker would end up leaving the band once again, and David Vincent came back in, and we get back to having a 3-piece with David, Trey, and Pete. But also during this touring cycle, towards the end of the 2000s, they would pick up a new second guitarist, and that's Thor Anders Myhren from Zyklon and Merkskog, also otherwise known as Destruct Thor. And he's a hell of a guitar player and a hell of a vocalist. If you want proof, check out the album Superior Massacre by Merkskog. It is fucking brutal, blackened death metal that you will love. And Destruct Thor is a hell of a guitar player, kind of similar to Eric Rutan in terms of style with the riffs and even lead work. So he would come into the band late, and also around this time, Pete Sandoval ended up having to have back surgery and ended up leaving the band in 2010. And they would pick up Tim Young on drums and would go back to the studio in 2011 with Eric Rutan, this time doing the production. And, well, in 2011, and perhaps some people should have figured out something was up because of the photo shoots, because David Vincent looked more like Nikki Sixx than he does David Vincent. And released in 2011 on Season of Mist Records, we get Illud Divinum Insanus, which is probably Latin for the worst anus in mankind. Oh my lord, this is dead last. This is number 9, hands down dead last. This is... one of the worst albums in metal history. Not the worst album of all time. There are far worse albums out there than this, but this album... And like, the common misconception I hear about this album is people want to say, oh, David Vincent wrote everything on here, so it's all his fault, because he came out of Genitortures, which was an industrial band with his wife. Hate to break it to you guys, but David's not 100% responsible for this album. If anything, he's like 20% responsible. Pretty much 80% of this album was written by Trey, because... at least according to Mike Browning during an interview with Reaper Metal Productions 2 years ago, that Trey was the one that wrote pretty much all the music because Trey is a big fan of techno. And I guess he felt like he got drunk and decided, oh, let's make a techno death metal album and see what happens. And David Vincent's like, okay, I mean, I played industrial, maybe it'll work. And sure enough, who wouldn't you know who won the pony? Now, the thing that makes this album very frustrating to me is you do get moments where there are some really cool riffs on this album, but they get ruined by these stupid-ass lyrics like Mountain Dew commercial lines and bullshit slogans, especially in tracks like Too Extreme and fucking Radicult. Also, Destructos versus the Earth Attack, that's like one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. Oh god, and I think Mike Browning said best, this should have just been like a Trey side project. This should not have been a Morbid Angel album. This album is a hate crime against metal. And yeah, and I'm gonna confess, I had never listened to this album all the way through until doing this ranking. And yeah, after that, I am never going to listen to it ever again. So, yeah. Fuck this album. And with how legendarily bad this album became, the band continued the tour for the next few years, and then in 2015, David Vincent and Destructor and Tim Young would end up leaving the band. Pretty much everybody left except for Trey. And then later in 2016... Steve Tucker came back, and then we would get a new drummer, and that's Scott Fuller from Havoc and Annihilated, and then second guitarist Dan Vandam Vaughn would come in on second guitars, and would return to the studio in 2016-2017, once again with Eric Rutan producing, and released in 2017 on Silver Lining Music, we would get Kingdoms Disdain. This is my second to last. This is my number 8 album. The reason why it's below Heretic is because I think the production on this album was worse than Heretic. Like, I love Eric Rutan's production, but he's had a few misfires, and this is definitely one of them. Like, the drums are way too loud, the guitars are a little quiet, there's not really much bass work, or not really much of a presence of the bass in the mix. Really, it's like the vocals and the drums kind of overpowered the guitars and the bass, and it sucks because there are some really cool riffs on here, though this album is kind of equal to Heretic in terms of songwriting. It's an okay album. It just kind of felt like they were playing it safe, which honestly they had to, because they had to save their brand somehow because of just how disastrous Elude was. So they thought, you know what, let's just get through this album just to kind of win back our fan base, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. So while they played it safe on this album, they kind of had to, and they pretty much kind of saved their brand. But of course, when you sink so low to the bottom of the barrel in terms of terrible albums, this is what they had to do, and to their credit, they were able to do it, and their career was kind of saved afterwards. Now, this would be the last Morbid Angel album as of right now, and not been hearing any news about them doing a new album. I'm hoping we would get a new one this year or next year, because I would love to hear if they improved on some of the mistakes they had on Kingdoms Disdained and come back in full force with another badass album, which I'm hoping that we get at some point soon. But yeah, despite the final 3 albums kind of staining Morbid Angel's discography, still Morbid Angel is one of the best death metal bands to ever exist. After all, they were one of the founding fathers, along with Death and Obituary and Possessed, if you want to include them. They're a founding father of this genre that we love, and first 6 albums are top-notch classics, at least in my mind, in death metal. So for those of you who have not checked out Morbid Angel, check out all their stuff, but be warned about the final 3, Heretic, Elude, and Kingdom's Disdain. You will get mixed results, but the first 6, from Altars through Gateways, you will be in for a hell of a good time and for some evil fucking brutality. But anyways, that does it for my ranking of everything Morbid Angel. What's your favorite Morbid Angel album? Let me know in the comments section below. And until next time, horns high. See you guys soon.
I've noticed that once people hit Slayer, they're like, is there something more extreme than Slayer?
Yeah, it's the crossroad, you know. Either you're going like, okay, this is too much, or you're like, I need more. Yeah, so I found Cannibal Corpse on YouTube when I was 12 or 13, and heard the Hammer Smash the Face bass solo.
Of course.
Of course, already then I was a bass player, but when I heard that, I was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. This is it. And then it just spiraled downwards from there.
And it just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Yeah, it never stops. It devours you.
Yeah, because